It was a project that I had poured months of effort into, every detail, every strategy, every late night spent fine-tuning the smallest aspects to perfection. And yet, when the time came for the presentation, my colleague, Sarah, stepped up and claimed it all. Not just a small piece of it, but the entire thing. She presented my work as if it were her own, with such confidence that the room of executives hung on her every word. I sat at the back of the conference room, a spectator to my own creation. It wasn't just the theft of credit that stung, it was the quiet dismissal of my contributions. Not a single word from Sarah acknowledging the work that went into the project. She smiled, basking in the praise, while I was left to stew in the shadows, sidelined and unseen. That was the moment I knew something needed to be done. I didn't confront Sarah. Not then. Not in front of everyone. No, I was smarter than that. Confrontation, while satisfying in the short term, rarely brings lasting consequences. But strategy? Strategy was something I was well versed in. I had no intention of letting this pass. Not only would I make sure she paid for what she did, but I would also make her regret ever thinking she could get away with it. Instead of voicing my anger, I decided to document everything. Every flaw in Sarah's presentation, every mistake she made, every policy she violated, meticulously catalogued. It became an obsession, but one that felt justified. As the days turned into weeks, I grew more certain of my plan. I wasn't going to let Sarah get away with taking credit for my work. The documentation wasn't just about proving who had done the real work, it was about constructing a case. Sarah wasn't as perfect as she seemed in the eyes of the executives. She had cut corners. She had made promises she couldn't keep. And all of it was there, waiting for the right moment to be exposed. The people around us, our colleagues, had begun to take notice of Sarah's increasing errors. What had once seemed like an impressive streak was slowly unraveling. And I, quietly observing, was waiting for her to slip up one final time. It's said that time has a way of revealing a person's true nature, and Sarah's actions were beginning to expose the cracks in her carefully crafted facade. I'd watched her closely in the weeks that followed, taking note of every misstep. She was a star, at least in her own eyes, but the glitter of her so-called brilliance was starting to dull. I kept my distance, keeping my observations to myself, but I could feel the satisfaction building each time I saw her stumble. I wasn't just watching Sarah, I was also making sure I was positioned perfectly. Everyone around her was too busy congratulating her on the surface-level success to notice the warning signs beneath. She made mistakes, and I was there to document each one, whether it was a missed deadline, a miscommunication with the clients, or a blatant disregard for company policy. It wasn't long before I had enough material to build a case, but I wasn't rushing things. Patience was key. There were moments when I wondered if it would be better to simply expose her outright. After all, the evidence was damning. But I knew better. A quick confrontation would be satisfying, yes, but it would also be a short-term victory. What I needed was something far more devastating. I needed to make sure that when Sarah's lies came to light, the fallout would be catastrophic, not just for her career, but for her reputation as well. I'd learned over the years that revenge wasn't about immediate gratification. It was about watching someone drown slowly, allowing them to build their own demise without even realizing it. And with each passing day, Sarah unknowingly did just that. She lied to our team about deadlines, taking credit for things that weren't hers to claim, all while pushing her failures under the rug. I made sure to keep track of every instance, creating a perfect, undeniable trail of her deceit. But what really struck me was how easily people bought into Sarah's narrative. She had this charisma about her, a smoothness that drew people in and made them overlook her shortcomings. It was as if the very idea of her success had become contagious. Everyone around her wanted to believe she was the key to the company's future, that she was the next big thing. Meanwhile, I stood in the background, watching her missteps grow like a cancer, knowing that one day it would all come crashing down. The tension was growing. And though Sarah felt untouchable, I was quietly, methodically waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I wasn't going to be the one to tear her down directly. No, that wouldn't be nearly as satisfying as when the walls finally closed in on her, and she realized too late who had been watching all along. And then, the inevitable happened. She slipped up again. A major presentation was coming up. The kind of high-stakes meeting that could define her career. She had promised to handle it, to take full responsibility. But as the date approached, it became clear that Sarah had overextended herself. She hadn't prepared as thoroughly as she had led everyone to believe. And her team, which I was a part of, was left to pick up the pieces of her disorganization. As she nervously tried to pull everything together in the final days before the presentation, I watched her unravel. This was it. The opportunity one had been waiting for. I made my move. The day before the presentation, I quietly reached out to a few key members of the executive team, people who had previously shown interest in Sarah's work but had been left in the dark about her repeated failures. I made sure to lay out the details, meticulously, carefully, without emotion. Just the facts. I didn't point fingers or accuse anyone outright, I simply provided the evidence I had gathered. It was a subtle approach, one that would cause the maximum amount of damage. I wanted Sarah's mistakes to become impossible to ignore. When the presentation arrived, she walked in full of confidence, unaware that the very people she had been trying to impress were already questioning her credibility. As she presented, I watched from the back of the room. Her hands shook ever so slightly, betraying the nerve she tried so hard to suppress. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. The executives exchanged glances, their expressions tight. They weren't convinced anymore. It wasn't just my evidence that was weighing on their minds, it was her failures that were starting to show. The moment the presentation ended, the questions began. Not the usual, polite follow-up questions, but pointed, direct ones that forced Sarah to fumble for answers. She stammered, tried to cover her tracks, but it was clear that the cracks were too deep now. And I, standing on the sidelines, watched with a quiet satisfaction as Sarah realized, perhaps too late, that her perfect image was crumbling before her eyes. But I wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. I knew that the fallout wouldn't come immediately. The real consequences wouldn't hit until Sarah had fully committed to her lies and could no longer backpedal. That was when I'd be ready to make my final move, ensuring that when the dust settled, the wreckage would be all hers. The days after the presentation were like a slow burn. Sarah tried to salvage the wreckage, but the damage was already done. The questions from the executives had revealed cracks in her story that could not be patched up. Her team started to sense the growing unease, and whispers began circulating in the office. It was clear to everyone that something wasn't right. Sarah's confidence, once unshakable, had crumbled to dust. But what Sarah didn't know was that I was biding my time. I wasn't in a rush to see her fall. I knew that true power in revenge lay in waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the final blow. I could see her trying to recover, trying to spin the story, trying to manipulate the situation back in her favor. She called in favors from colleagues who once saw her as a mentor, asking for their support and guidance, all the while pretending nothing had changed. I watched from afar, a silent observer as her world grew smaller, more suffocating. But there was still no direct confrontation. I didn't need to make it personal, not yet. What I needed was something far more impactful, the truth. And I had plenty of that. The real opportunity came when the department underwent an internal audit. It was the perfect setup. The audit was supposed to be routine, a simple check to ensure that budgets were being followed and that everything was operating within company policies. But to me, it was the perfect chance to bring Sarah's deception into the light. I had prepared for this moment for months. With all the evidence I had quietly gathered, the missed deadlines, the lack of transparency, and the blatant disregard for policies, I knew it was only a matter of time before the auditors would start digging. They would uncover the lies. They would see the chaos she had created. And I would be there, ready to ensure that Sarah couldn't escape the consequences of her actions. The audit began quietly, as these things usually do. Sarah was nervous but tried to keep up the appearance of control. She greeted the auditors with a fake smile and led them through her department, as if everything were fine. I watched from my desk as she tried to cover her tracks, but the truth had a way of slipping through the cracks, no matter how tightly you tried to hold onto it. And then, like clockwork, it happened. One of the auditors, a sharp and meticulous woman named Linda, came to me with a question. She had noticed something off in the report Sarah had submitted. There were discrepancies, small at first, but enough to raise suspicion. Linda had been in the company long enough to know when something wasn't adding up. I didn't need to pretend. I already knew what she was asking. I had expected it. I simply leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice steady as I said, "Let me show you something." With that, I handed her the folder, everything meticulously documented. The emails, the budget mismanagement, the broken promises to clients, the violated policies, all of it was laid out before her in a neat, undeniable line. Linda didn't say anything at first. She just skimmed through the documents, her eyes narrowing as she took in the weight of it all. Finally, she looked up at me. This is serious, Edward," she said quietly. "Are you sure about all of this?" I nodded. Absolutely. Sarah's been covering up her mistakes, pretending everything is fine. But it's not. And I'm not the only one who's noticed. Linda didn't waste any time. She immediately set up a meeting with the head of HR and the auditing team, and within hours, Sarah was called into the conference room. I sat just outside, knowing that the noose was tightening around her neck. Sarah, at this point, had no idea what was coming. She still thought she could talk her way out of it, that her charm would win over the higher-ups. But she had underestimated just how much damage her lies had caused. The truth had come to light, and there was no turning back. I didn't attend the meeting, but I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was happening. Sarah was being grilled, forced to answer for everything she had hidden. It was only a matter of time before the full extent of her lies became clear. And as I sat there, listening to the voices rise and fall in the conference room, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. This was the moment I had been waiting for. But I wasn't done yet. The real destruction wasn't going to come from the meeting alone. The fallout, the long-term consequences, would come when the truth reached the rest of the company. I had set everything in motion, and now I just had to let the pieces fall into place. The next few hours felt like an eternity. As the day dragged on, I kept my focus on the one thing that mattered, the slow unraveling of Sarah's carefully constructed persona. She had played the role of the hard-working, brilliant star, but now the cracks were widening, and the world was starting to see her for who she really was. Finally, I got the confirmation. Word began to spread through the office like wildfire. The department heads were discussing Sarah's behavior, and whispers of the audit results were reaching everyone. By the time the afternoon rolled around, Sarah was already being sidelined. She had no idea, but her career was already in freefall. I didn't feel vindicated, at least, not yet. But I did feel something else, a sense of justice. Sarah had taken credit for my work, she had manipulated everyone around her, and she had thought she could get away with it. But now, she was learning that there are consequences for that kind of deceit. And I was just getting started. By the time the dust had settled from the audit, the atmosphere at the office had shifted. The executives, once enamored with Sarah's facade, were now looking at her with suspicion. The team that had once supported her, mostly out of loyalty to the image she had created, was now quietly distancing themselves. I could see it in the way people avoided eye contact with her, the way her emails went unanswered, the way her calls went straight to voicemail. Sarah was isolated, and it wasn't long before her insecurities began to show. The real turning point came when the company's quarterly meeting was scheduled. This was the big one, the one where all department leads were to present their progress, their results, and their future strategies. Everyone knew that this meeting would be her chance to recover, to salvage whatever was left of her reputation. But she had already lost her footing, and I knew this was where the final blow would land. I didn't plan on being in the room during her presentation, but it wasn't hard to make sure I was. I had already orchestrated a way to be included in the audience. It wasn't a mistake, I had made sure of it. I had to be there when everything unraveled. When Sarah took the stage, she did so with the same level of confidence she had once exuded. But there was a new tremor in her voice, an uncertainty in her posture that only a few had noticed at first. Still, she pushed through the presentation, going over the same charts, the same projections, the same promises. But as she spoke, it became apparent that something wasn't right. Her slides didn't match the data she was presenting. She stumbled over numbers she had once known by heart, and when asked direct questions about her methodology, she fumbled, her answers vague and unconvincing. The executives exchanged concerned glances, their brows furrowing as they realized the truth that had been lurking under the surface for so long. The wheels were turning in their heads. They were putting together the pieces of the puzzle. I watched, leaning back in my chair, my eyes never leaving Sarah's face. It was an odd feeling, seeing her up there, the same person who had once taken all the credit for my work, now struggling to maintain any semblance of control. The same people who had once praised her now looked at her with doubt. Her smile, which had always seemed so genuine, now seemed hollow. But the best part came just moments later, when the company's CEO, a sharp and no-nonsense woman named Eleanor, asked Sarah a pointed question about the discrepancies in the reports. She asked it with such coldness that the entire room seemed to fall silent. I had been prepared for this moment, but Sarah clearly wasn't. She tried to explain, but the more she spoke, the worse she looked. Her excuses crumbled under the weight of her lies. The CEO's expression hardened, and the room seemed to close in on her. "Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice icy, "we've received multiple reports questioning your methods and your results. This isn't the first time there have been discrepancies, and it certainly isn't the first time your team has had to clean up after you. Can you explain why your team's reports have consistently fallen short of the standards we expect from leadership in this company?" The room fell even quieter. I could hear Sarah's breathing become shallow, her face flushing with panic. It was like watching a balloon slowly deflate in real time. She tried to recover, but the damage had already been done. The truth was out in the open now. Everyone knew. The whispers started almost immediately. The executives began exchanging looks, their judgment of Sarah becoming more and more apparent. I could see the shift, the disbelief in their eyes as they processed the betrayal that had been sitting under their noses all along. Sarah had played the part of the perfect employee, the perfect leader, the perfect everything. But now, in the face of scrutiny, she was nothing more than a fraud. And I, from the back of the room, watched it all unfold. But it wasn't just the collapse of her professional reputation that satisfied me. It was the way she was finally exposed for the person she truly was, someone who had relied on manipulation and deceit to get ahead. Someone who had no qualms about stealing the credit for others' hard work. Someone who had thought she could get away with everything, all while undermining the very people who had helped her get to the top. The presentation ended in disaster. Sarah, flustered and clearly panicked, tried to salvage what was left, but it was impossible. Eleanor asked for her to step down from her leadership position immediately and advised her that a full internal review of her actions would take place. As Sarah left the stage, her face pale and her head low, the room erupted into murmurs. Some people, like I knew they would, expressed sympathy, while others shared quiet, knowing glances. For the first time, Sarah had no audience to cheer her on. She was alone. She was exposed. And I was watching her downfall unfold exactly the way I had planned. But the best part was yet to come. I knew that once the dust settled, Sarah wouldn't just lose her job, she would lose everything. Her carefully constructed image, the respect she had cultivated from others, and the influence she had wielded over her colleagues would all crumble. And I, Edward, would have been the one to make sure she had nowhere to hide. The next phase of the plan was simple, but incredibly effective. It was time for Sarah to face the consequences of her actions. I had everything in place. All the evidence, all the lies she had told, and all the mistakes she had made would be aired in front of the entire company. Her punishment, though, wouldn't be swift. No. It would be drawn out. Because nothing hurt more than seeing someone slowly realize they had been caught, especially when they thought they were untouchable. I was patient. I would let Sarah stew in the silence of her own undoing for as long as it took. The fallout from the quarterly meeting was swift. Sarah was ousted from her leadership role, but that was just the beginning. The company initiated an internal investigation, diving into every detail of her work, every decision she had made, and every shady tactic she had used to climb the corporate ladder. She had underestimated just how much power the truth held. The moment those executives started digging, they uncovered a long trail of her manipulations, all carefully covered up by her charm and deception. I knew Sarah's downfall would be drawn out, but watching it unfold with such precision gave me a sense of satisfaction I hadn't expected. I had been patient, gathering evidence, planting seeds of doubt, and quietly watching from the sidelines as her world began to crumble. Now, it was as if a dam had broken. Once the executives had caught wind of her lies, they couldn't stop the flood of revelations. But the real beauty of it all was how slowly the consequences came. Sarah wasn't just stripped of her position. She was sidelined. She became the subject of office gossip, the one everyone spoke about but no one wanted to work with. People who had once kissed up to her were now keeping their distance, whispering about her failures behind closed doors. And she knew it. I could see it in her eyes every time we passed each other in the hallways. The weight of her isolation was suffocating her. Sarah tried to put on a brave face, to pretend like she was still in control, but it was becoming harder and harder for her to do so. She showed up late to meetings, her team became more and more disillusioned with her leadership, and her ideas started falling flat. She was no longer the golden child, she was the office pariah. I watched with a mix of amusement and detachment as she tried to salvage what was left of her reputation. She started reaching out to me, sending me texts asking for help, for guidance, for just a little bit of support. She had become desperate, and I knew exactly what she was trying to do. She wanted me to rescue her, to help her rebuild her image so she could claw her way back to some semblance of power. But that wasn't going to happen. Not after everything she had done. I never responded to her texts. I never even looked her way when she passed by my desk. I kept my distance, letting her stew in the mess she had created for herself. And the longer I watched her spiral, the more I realized how sweet the silence had become. There was nothing more satisfying than seeing someone who thought they were untouchable slowly understand the weight of their actions. But it didn't stop there. The rumors continued to spread, and soon, Sarah's mistakes were known across the company. The internal review had unearthed everything: the missed deadlines, the false promises to clients, the budgetary discrepancies. But the most damning discovery was the blatant manipulation of the project that I had worked on. The executives, who had initially praised her for her innovative ideas, now realized that the success of the project had been built on my work, not hers. I had taken great care in ensuring that the right people knew the truth. It wasn't about me being recognized, but about Sarah being exposed for the fraud she was. The executives were furious. They had trusted her, and now, they felt betrayed. And just when I thought things couldn't get any worse for her, they did. Sarah was called into a meeting with the CEO and the head of HR. I overheard their conversation in the break room one afternoon, and it was clear that the end was near. They didn't mince words. They told her that her behavior had not only undermined the company's goals but had also violated several key policies. They gave her an ultimatum: resign voluntarily, or face a formal investigation that would tarnish her reputation forever. She didn't take it well. For the first time, I saw Sarah break. She was no longer the confident, polished professional I had once seen take credit for my work. Now, she was a shell of that person. Her composure shattered, and I could see the panic in her eyes. This wasn't just about losing her position, it was about losing everything. Her career, her status, her sense of control, it was all slipping away, and she couldn't do anything to stop it. I knew this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when Sarah would truly understand the price of her deceit. But even in her moment of desperation, Sarah didn't fully grasp the extent of her fall. She still didn't realize that the web I had spun around her was much larger than she thought. She thought her problems were just with the company, with the executives, but I had made sure that the truth would leak out far beyond those walls. The next day, the company's internal memo went out. It was a small paragraph buried within a sea of updates, but it contained the final nail in Sarah's coffin: Sarah has resigned effective immediately. We wish her the best in her future endeavors. There was no mention of the real reason for her departure. No mention of the lies, the manipulation, or the deceit. But everyone knew. The whispers spread like wildfire across the office. And Sarah? She was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered career, alone. It was a slow, painful process. She spent weeks in limbo, avoiding the office, trying to rebuild her reputation. But by then, the damage had been done. She had been publicly exposed, and there was no coming back from it. Her friends in the office had vanished, and the colleagues who once admired her now avoided her at all costs. And as Sarah's career continued to spiral, I couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had stolen my work, taken my credit, and thought she could get away with it. But in the end, it was her own actions that had led to her downfall. And I, Edward, had been the one to ensure she would never forget what she had done. The silence that followed was the sweetest victory. Sarah had vanished from the office. She was gone, swallowed up by the abyss of her own failure. The whispers about her had quieted down, replaced by new stories, new office drama. But for me, this wasn't over. It had never been about seeing her leave, it had been about the slow, suffocating realization that she would never regain what she had stolen from me. And then, weeks after her resignation, she called. I'd expected it. The desperation in her voice was evident before she even spoke. Edward, she said, her voice shaky, I need to talk to you. Can we meet? I could almost hear the weight of the words in her plea. She had nothing left. Her career, her reputation, her influence, they were all gone. She was a ghost, haunting the place where she once ruled. I agreed, not out of any compassion, but because I knew this was the moment when everything would come full circle. She had taken everything from me, but now, it was my turn to make her fully understand the cost of her actions. We met at a small cafe, the kind where people went to get lost in their thoughts. Sarah looked different. Her sharp clothes, once a symbol of her power, were now worn and ill-fitting. Her posture, once poised, was now slouched in defeat. I sat across from her, calm and composed, watching as she shifted uneasily in her seat. I know what you're thinking, she said, eyes darting around the cafe, avoiding mine. I've messed up. I've lost everything. But I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't realize what it would cost. I leaned back in my chair, considering her words. You didn't realize? I repeated, my tone steady. Sarah, you knew exactly what you were doing. You took credit for my work, stole from me, and pushed me aside. You played the part of the innocent, hard-working leader, but underneath, you were nothing more than a fraud. She flinched at the word, but didn't deny it. Instead, she bit her lip, struggling for words. I was trying to climb the ladder, Edward. I thought I needed to get ahead, that if I just kept pretending, if I kept lying, that everything would work out. But it didn't. And now, I have nothing. I watched her carefully, letting the silence stretch between us. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when she would finally understand that it wasn't just her position, her career, that I had taken. It was her pride, her dignity, and the truth. The truth had always been there, buried beneath the lies, and now it was out in the open. Did you ever think about what it would feel like to be the one who got betrayed? I asked, my voice low. Did you ever stop for a moment to think about how it would feel to have someone take what's yours, claim it as their own, and then push you out of the picture like you never mattered? Sarah's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place, regret, shame, or maybe both. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she looked down at the table, defeated. I didn't think it would come to this, she whispered. I didn't think it would hurt so much, losing everything. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together. I leaned forward, my eyes locking with hers. That's the thing, Sarah. You didn't think. You didn't care about anyone else's hard work or anyone else's pain. You thought you could get away with it, that you could use people to climb higher and higher. But you never considered the consequences. And now? Now, you've lost it all. Her eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Edward. I really am. I didn't mean to hurt you. It was the apology I had been waiting for, the one that would have meant something if it had come earlier, before she had stolen my credit, before she had manipulated me and everyone else around her. But now, it was too late. Apologies couldn't undo the damage she had caused. They couldn't bring back the trust she had broken or the respect she had stolen. I don't need your apology, Sarah, I said quietly. What you need is to face the consequences of your actions. You can't just walk away from this, hoping everything will go back to normal. You don't get to ruin people's lives and expect no repercussions. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I studied her for a moment longer, taking in the woman who had once been so confident, so ruthless in her ambition. Now, she was a shadow of herself, broken and pleading. And while a part of me might have once felt sympathy, it was gone now. The satisfaction wasn't in watching her beg, it was in knowing that she had finally realized the weight of her mistakes. Good, I said finally, standing up from the table. I hope you remember this moment when you try to rebuild your life. Because the damage you've done isn't something that can be fixed easily. As I turned to walk away, I heard her voice crack behind me. Edward, please, don't leave me like this. But I didn't turn back. I couldn't. I had already given her everything she needed to understand the depth of her actions. The lesson had been learned, not because of my words, but because of everything that had come before. The fall from grace, the quiet isolation, and the loss of everything she had built. That was her punishment, the one that would last far longer than any direct confrontation or anger. I walked out of the cafe and into the evening air, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice, and Sarah had finally been forced to see the truth. And as I walked away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. This was over. Sarah had been caught in her own lies, and there was no coming back from it. Weeks passed, but the shadow of Sarah's downfall lingered, not just over her, but over the entire company. People whispered about her failure, and though the office eventually moved on to other dramas, the truth had already spread like wildfire. Sarah was no longer just a failed leader, she had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that betrayal, no matter how subtly executed, always comes back to bite. What struck me, though, was how quickly the world had moved on. Sarah's story had become old news, buried beneath the new challenges and victories of the team. No one cared anymore about the work she had stolen or the lies she had woven into the fabric of her success. The executives, the people she had manipulated, had all turned their attention to the future, to the next big thing. And I? I had become a quiet observer, satisfied with the way things had played out, but removed from it all. Sarah, on the other hand, had not moved on. She tried to salvage what little was left of her career, but each step forward only seemed to bring her 2 steps back. The calls from headhunters went unanswered, her LinkedIn profile remained stagnant, and the promises of opportunities from her former colleagues became hollow, empty gestures. She tried to find solace in old friends, but the damage was too deep. The betrayal had been too public. Everyone knew. I had heard that she moved to a smaller apartment in a quieter part of the city, one far removed from the bustling downtown area where she had once lived in the heart of everything. I also heard that she'd started looking for work in a completely different industry, one where her reputation wouldn't be as easily traced. A part of me almost pitied her, but only for a second. She had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. For me, life went on without the burden of Sarah's betrayal. I had reclaimed my peace, my position, and my self-respect. The project that Sarah had stolen from me had been a massive success, and I had made sure the executives knew who the real architect behind it had been. While Sarah floundered in the wake of her lies, I was given the chance to lead a new team, a new initiative, one that felt more genuine, more fulfilling. But even with these new opportunities, I never lost sight of what I had learned. The office was a quieter place without Sarah. There were no more dramatic power plays, no more manipulations to watch unfold. The team I worked with was cohesive, supportive, and free of the toxic atmosphere that had once permeated the halls when Sarah ruled. I couldn't say that I was happy about the way things had gone down. What had happened to her was brutal, even if it was deserved, but I couldn't deny the relief I felt in seeing the toxicity finally removed from the office. But as Sarah's isolation grew, I found myself looking back on the past more than I had expected. There were times when I wondered if I could have confronted her sooner, or if I had been too detached from the situation. But then I reminded myself why I had done things the way I had waited because I knew that revenge wasn't about revenge itself, it was about ensuring the person who wronged you understood exactly why they were brought down, and most importantly, that they understood the cost of their betrayal. Sarah had stolen my work, my ideas, and my dignity. But she had never considered the price of that. She had assumed that, like everyone else she had used, I would fade into the background and let her take the glory. What she failed to see was that people like me don't fade quietly. We rise. And when the time is right, we make sure that the world knows who truly deserves the credit. And then, one day, I got an unexpected call. It was from Sarah. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I sat there for a moment, contemplating. Was she truly looking for redemption? Or was this just another plea for help, a desperate attempt to crawl back into a world that had already cast her out? The voicemail she left was brief, but it was clear she was no longer the confident, calculated woman I had once known. "Edward," she said, her voice cracking, "I don't know if you'll ever listen to this, but I need to apologize. I was wrong. I was selfish and I hurt you, and I know I can't take it back. But I want you to know that I regret what I did to you. I just need you to hear that from me. Please." I sat there in silence after hearing the message. There was a part of me that understood why she would reach out after everything had fallen apart. Guilt had a way of catching up with you, especially when the world you had built came crashing down. But it was too late. Her actions had already set things in motion, and I had long since moved past the need for closure. I deleted the voicemail, my finger hovering over the screen. Maybe it was cold, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. The truth was, Sarah's apology meant little to me now. It had taken her losing everything to realize what she had done, and by then, I was already long gone from the wreckage she had created. As the days passed, I didn't think much about Sarah anymore. Life at work became easier, more focused. I was finally free from the shadow of her deceit. The new project I was working on was thriving, and the team I led was excited, motivated, and driven. I felt a sense of accomplishment that had eluded me before, not because of the project itself, but because of the way I had handled things. And in the quiet moments, when I thought back on it all, on how Sarah had manipulated, lied, and taken from me, I realized something important. Revenge, true revenge, wasn't about making someone suffer in the moment. It was about watching them wrestle with the aftermath, about knowing that their betrayal had consequences far greater than they ever imagined. Sarah had lost everything. And that, in itself, was the sweetest form of revenge. But the best part? It wasn't even about the revenge anymore. It was about the quiet, unspoken satisfaction of knowing that I had remained unbroken while she had fallen apart. That was the true victory. And as I moved forward, I knew I had learned something important. People like Sarah, who betray others to get ahead, are always the ones who ultimately pay the highest price. They think they can take from others and rise to the top, but in the end, they're the ones who fall the hardest. I was living proof of that. And as for Sarah? She had become a lesson, a story to be told to those who believed they could get away with the same. Months passed, and as life continued its quiet march forward, the echoes of Sarah's betrayal began to fade. She had slipped into the background, nothing more than a memory for the few who had once seen her as a leader, and a cautionary tale for those who had witnessed her rise and fall. But for me, the story wasn't truly over, not yet. There was still one final piece to put in place. As time went on, the new project I had spearheaded began to flourish. The department I led was growing at an impressive rate, and my colleagues looked to me for guidance. I wasn't the ambitious, credit-hungry man I'd once been, chasing validation from those above me. No, I had learned that leadership wasn't about stealing glory, it was about earning respect through hard work and integrity. And that was exactly what I was doing. But then, a strange thing happened. One afternoon, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. It was short, cryptic even, and it caught me off guard. The subject line read, "We need to talk." At first, I assumed it was just some spam or an irrelevant inquiry. But something in the back of my mind told me to open it. I clicked on the message, and it was from Sarah. The tone was different this time, not the frantic, desperate plea from before. No, this one was calmer, almost measured. "Edward," the email began, "I know you've moved on, and I've been trying to do the same. But there's something I need to tell you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything from you, really. I just need you to know that everything I did to you was wrong. And I realize now that I've spent so much time blaming everyone else for my failures that I never stopped to see my own. I've made mistakes, and I need to own them, finally. But there's something more I need to say. This isn't just about me. It's about you and the way I took from you. You deserve to hear the truth." I sat there, reading the email several times. It wasn't an apology wrapped in self-pity like the previous one. This time, there was a tone of acceptance. Sarah wasn't asking for anything anymore. She had come to terms with the fact that her actions had consequences, and now, she was acknowledging that she had wronged me, not just professionally, but personally. The email went on to explain something I hadn't expected. Sarah had sought therapy after her fall from grace. She had started to unravel the layers of her own insecurities, the need to prove herself, and the need for control. She admitted that much of her actions had been driven by her fear of failure, and her jealousy of those around her, especially me. She had wanted what I had, recognition, respect, and the success that came with it. And in the process, she had destroyed not just my trust, but her own life. I read the words, and for the first time since it had all begun, I felt a shift. There was no satisfaction in it, no gloating, no joy. Just a quiet, almost sorrowful understanding. She had done irreparable damage to herself, but she had finally come to the painful realization that her choices were what led her to this point. She was living with the consequences now. And that, I realized, was the true form of justice. I closed the email without responding. I didn't feel the need to. The truth was out there, and Sarah had acknowledged it. There was nothing left to say. She had taken credit for my work, she had manipulated and lied, but in the end, she had been forced to reckon with her own actions. It was clear she was trying to rebuild, but the foundation had crumbled beneath her. She would never again be the person she once was. No amount of therapy or apologies could fix that. As for me, I moved forward. Life went on, and with it, I continued to build my career. But this time, I did it with a deeper understanding of myself and of the people around me. I had learned that revenge wasn't always about tearing someone down. Sometimes, it was simply about letting time and the truth do the work for you. And perhaps, in some way, I had found peace in knowing that Sarah would never forget the lessons she had learned, no matter how painful they were. She would forever remember the cost of her betrayal, and how, in the end, she had lost everything, not just her job, but her sense of self. I didn't need her to suffer further. The universe had already dealt with that. So, I moved on. There were no final confrontations, no dramatic showdowns. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place quietly, and Sarah was left with the heavy weight of her own regrets. She would carry that with her for the rest of her life, a silent reminder of what happens when you betray the wrong person. And as I looked to the future, I knew that I had done things the right way, not with bitterness, not with malice, but with patience and the knowledge that, in the end, people's true nature always reveals itself. Sarah had shown me who she truly was, and I had shown her exactly what happens when you take from the wrong person.